On March 21, 2012, police rushed to a quiet home in El Cajon, California. Inside, 17-year-old Fatima had found her mother, Shaima Al-Awadi, lying on the dining room floor, badly beaten and fighting for her life. Next to her was a note that read, "This is my country, go back to yours, terrorist." The message shocked everyone. Neighbors, friends, and news outlets all believed it was a hate crime. Vigils were held, and Shaima's story was compared to other cases of racial violence happening at the time. For a moment, it felt like proof of deep prejudice in America. But as detectives looked closer, the scene didn't make sense. The note was not an original threat. It was a copy of one already seen before. The glass door that looked broken by an intruder had actually been smashed from the inside. What first appeared to be a crime of hate began to look like something far more personal. By the end of the year, police arrested Shaima's husband, Kasim Al-Himidi. What the world had mourned as an attack by a stranger was revealed to be a crime born inside her own family. A twist so shocking that it turned the whole case upside down. This is the story of the murder of Shaima Al-Awadi, how a single morning in El Cajon set off a chain of revelations that would travel far beyond the streets where it began, and how the pursuit of truth would expose not just a killer, but the fractures within a family trying to balance tradition with American freedom. Welcome to the Crime Series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. To understand the events that would one day place Shaima Al-Awadi's name in headlines around the world, we have to begin thousands of miles away from the quiet California suburb where she would ultimately settle. Her story starts in Iraq, a nation whose long history is threaded with both cultural richness and political upheaval. Shaima was born in the 1970s into a Shiite Muslim family. At that time, Iraq was a country of sharp contrasts, home to ancient Mesopotamian heritage and thriving city life in places like Baghdad and Basra, but also ruled by an increasingly authoritarian regime under Saddam Hussein. For Iraq's Shiite population, the 1980s and early 1990s brought particular hardship. Sectarian divisions deepened, and political repression became an everyday reality. Shaima's childhood, like many others of her generation, was marked by the undercurrent of these tensions. In her family's home, faith and tradition were central. The values of respect, modesty, and strong family ties shaped her upbringing. She was known among relatives for her warmth and willingness to help, traits that would follow her into adulthood. But beyond the walls of her family home, Iraq was becoming an increasingly dangerous place for those who belonged to certain religious or political groups. By the early 1990s, Saddam Hussein's government had survived both the long and exhausting Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War with the United States-led coalition. In the aftermath of the Gulf War in 1991, uprisings erupted across Iraq, particularly in the Shiite-dominated south. These uprisings were met with brutal crackdowns. Entire communities were devastated, and countless families were forced to make difficult decisions about their future. The brutality was personal for Shaima's family. Her father had been tortured by Hussein's regime, and her uncle was hanged during the uprising, violence that left deep scars on a family that had simply sought to live according to their faith. Shaima's family was among those who saw no path to safety if they remained in Iraq. The political climate had shifted from tense to intolerable, and the risks of staying grew with each passing day. Seeking refuge became less of a choice and more of a necessity. The path to America began with displacement. In the early 1990s, Shaima's family left Iraq and made their way to Saudi Arabia. For Iraqi Shiites, Saudi Arabia was not necessarily an ideal refuge. Its own religious and political climate was far from welcoming, but it provided a temporary escape from the violence back home. Life there was transitional. The family lived in limbo, unsure how long they would remain or what the next step might be. It was during this time that they applied for refugee resettlement to the United States, joining thousands of other Iraqis who were seeking safety and stability far from the turmoil of their homeland. The U.S. government, through various refugee programs, offered sanctuary to many displaced Iraqis in the 1990s, especially those whose lives had been threatened in the wake of the uprisings. In 1993, when Shaima was still a young woman, her family's application was approved. They were relocated to Detroit, Michigan, a city that had by then become home to one of the largest Arab American communities in the United States. For many new arrivals from the Middle East, Detroit offered something unique: familiar cultural networks, access to halal food, Arabic-speaking neighbors, and mosques where they could continue to practice their faith openly. For Shaima, the move was both a relief and a challenge. The relief came in knowing she no longer had to live in the shadow of political persecution. The challenge came in adapting to a new culture, language, and way of life. Detroit in the early 1990s was a city in transition, marked by economic decline in some neighborhoods, but also by tight-knit immigrant communities who looked after one another. Shaima quickly became part of that fabric. Life in Detroit for Shaima's family revolved around rebuilding, finding work, enrolling in school, and forging a new sense of identity in a land far from the place they once called home. For Shaima, education was important, but so was staying connected to her heritage. She dressed modestly, spoke Arabic at home, and maintained close ties to her community. At the same time, she was learning to navigate American life, English language skills, public services, and the social expectations that came with living in the United States. It was during these formative years in Michigan that Shaima's life began to take the shape it would hold for the next 2 decades. She met people from a wide range of backgrounds, both inside and outside the Arab American community. And somewhere in those early years of resettlement, she crossed paths with the man who would later become her husband, Kasim Al-Himidi. Shaima first met Kasim Al-Himidi not long after arriving in the United States. Like her, Kasim was an Iraqi immigrant. He, too, had left his homeland in search of safety and a future beyond the reach of Saddam Hussein's government. Their introduction came through the familiar and trusted channels of their community: family acquaintances, mutual friends, and the close-knit Iraqi-American network that bridged cities like Detroit and San Diego. In those circles, marriages often formed quickly, grounded in shared cultural and religious values, even if the couple's personal acquaintance was brief. By the mid-1990s, the couple married, joining their lives and starting a family. Their early married years were spent in Detroit, but soon, the pull of opportunity and the desire for a warmer climate drew them westward. In 1996, they relocated to San Diego County, California, settling in El Cajon, a city that, like Detroit, had a significant Iraqi immigrant population. El Cajon gave Shaima something she had long hoped for: a calmer, suburban life far from the busy, uncertain streets of Detroit. The homes were modest, the neighborhoods were filled with other Iraqi families, and the rhythms of daily life were easier to manage. Here, Shaima could raise her 5 children, hold on to the traditions of her upbringing, and still navigate the new realities of life in America. Part of the reason the family moved west was Kasim's work. He, along with some of Shaima's brothers, joined programs that trained U.S. soldiers before deployment to Iraq. They taught language basics, explained cultural customs, and helped service members prepare for what they would face overseas. For Kasim, this work carried respect in the community. He was helping American soldiers understand his homeland while serving his adopted country. For Shaima, it meant stability, a steady income, and the ability to focus on her role at home. To those who met them in the early years, Shaima and Kasim seemed like a well-matched couple. They spoke the same language, shared the same faith, and both had endured the hardship of leaving everything behind in Iraq. Their marriage looked traditional. Kasim worked outside the home, while Shaima cared for the children and kept the household running. She cooked, cleaned, and made sure her children were cared for, while also staying active in her mosque. In public, their life seemed steady and ordinary. Kasim was often described as a strong but traditional patriarch, someone who held firmly to cultural values and even served as an elder at the East County Mosque the family attended. Shaima, on the other hand, was remembered as the gentle presence at the mosque. the one who organized meals, helped other women settle into the community, and stayed behind to tidy up after gatherings. It was the picture of a family rooted in faith and discipline, even if, behind closed doors, court records later revealed signs of stress. But as the years passed, the pressures of raising children in America began to show. The biggest strain wasn't money or housing, it was parenting. Raising teenagers in America, with its freedom and different values, clashed with Kasim and Shaima's more traditional Iraqi expectations. How much freedom should the children have? Who could they be friends with? How would they balance school, faith, and family honor? These questions weighed on Shaima most of all, because she was the one who lived them every day inside the home. Faith was her anchor. Shaima wore her hijab proudly, not because someone forced her, but because it reflected who she was. Each day began with prayer. Each evening ended with family meals where she laid out rich stews, fragrant rice, and the breads she had learned to bake in her childhood kitchen back in Iraq. Food was not just food. It was a bridge, keeping her children connected to a homeland they had never really known. Her devotion extended into the community. The mosque was more than a place of worship, it was a lifeline for Iraqi families trying to build a new life. Shaima gave her time freely. She helped women who arrived in Al-Cajon with little English, guided young mothers through the challenges of parenting in a new country, and offered a warm smile to anyone who seemed lost. At religious holidays, she was always present, organizing, cooking, helping with celebrations. Many people in the community remember her not for any single act, but for her consistency, her presence, her patience, her willingness to help without being asked. Shaima carried herself with quiet dignity. She was respectful, kind, and never sought attention. Yet those who knew her say she had a strength about her, the kind that comes from surviving displacement, building a life from scratch, and raising 5 children while holding fast to her values. This was the world Shaima built for herself in Al-Cajon. A home shaped by tradition, a faith that guided her, and a community where she was seen as both a helper and a role model. To those around her, she seemed to embody the resilience of an immigrant mother who had endured so much and yet still gave so much of herself to others. The Alawadi children were growing up straddling 2 worlds. At school, they were immersed in American culture. At home, they lived by the customs and expectations of their parents' generation. This balancing act was not always easy, but Shaima made it clear that their faith and heritage were non-negotiable parts of their identity. She taught them Arabic at home and made sure they understood religious traditions. She encouraged respect for elders, modesty, and the importance of family unity. Her relationship with her children was deeply maternal, but also, at times, bound by the firm discipline expected in more traditional households. In particular, her teenage daughter Fatima's life reflected the tension many first-generation immigrant children feel, the push and pull between the expectations of their parents and the realities of the culture around them. Shaima wanted her children to succeed in America, but she also wanted them to remain firmly rooted in their heritage. Their eldest daughter, Fatima, became a focal point of these tensions. In November, police responded to a call about suspicious activity and encountered the 17-year-old in a parked car with a 21-year-old man named Ronak Yaqub. Ronak was everything that would have alarmed Fatima's traditional parents. At 21, he was older than their teenage daughter. More significantly, he was Chaldean Christian, a member of Iraq's ancient Christian minority, but still representing a different faith from the devout Shiite Muslim family that had raised Fatima. In the close-knit Iraqi community of Al-Cajon, religious boundaries often determined social ones, and a romantic relationship across these lines was not merely discouraged, it was seen as a threat to family honor and religious identity. When police found them together that November evening, the nature of their encounter suggested an intimacy that would have horrified Fatima's parents. The cultural implications were staggering. Not only was this behavior unacceptable by her family's traditional standards, but the young man represented everything her parents feared about American influence on their children. When Shaima arrived at the scene to retrieve her daughter, the humiliation was profound. In their community, a daughter's behavior reflected directly on the family's reputation and honor. The drive home became a moment of crisis that would haunt both mother and daughter for months to come. During their conversation in the car, as Shaima likely struggled to find words for her disappointment and fear, Fatima made a devastating choice that revealed the depth of her desperation. She told her mother, "I love you, Mom," opened the door, and jumped from the moving vehicle. An incident that police reports noted occurred at roughly 35 miles per hour. The physical injuries from the jump were serious enough to require hospitalization, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. Paramedics and hospital staff later reported that Fatima told them she was being forced to marry her cousin in Iraq and did not want to do so, that this arranged marriage was why she had jumped from the car. The jump was both an act of rebellion and a cry for help from a teenager caught between her love for a young man and her family's expectations. The incident captured a family at a breaking point. No matter one's cultural frame, the event revealed the profound stress of trying to navigate between two worlds, one that valued arranged marriages and family honor, and another that emphasized individual choice and freedom. In the immediate aftermath of the car incident, it appeared that Fatima had learned her lesson. She seemed to have broken off contact with Ronak Yaqub, focusing instead on her family relationships and trying to repair the damage caused by her rebellion. To her parents and the community, it looked like a teenage mistake had been corrected, and the family could move forward with their traditional expectations intact. But the story of Fatima's relationship was far more complex than anyone realized. During the trial that would follow her mother's death, devastating details emerged that revealed the full scope of the deception that had been unfolding in the Al-Himidi household. Fatima admitted that despite appearing to have broken off the relationship with Ronak months before the attack, she had actually been secretly meeting with him at the family home. "I'd sneak him in sometimes," she said. "There was a few times I'd sneak him in at night. I'd open the door for him." The admission was shocking, not just for what it revealed about Fatima's deception, but for what it suggested about the level of tension and secrecy that had been building in the household. While Shaima and Kasim believed they had successfully ended their daughter's inappropriate relationship, Fatima was actually conducting clandestine meetings in their own home. These revelations painted a picture of a teenager living an elaborate double life, publicly conforming to her family's expectations while privately engaging in exactly the behavior they had forbidden. The secret meetings, the hidden relationship, and the passionate text messages all suggested that far from being resolved, the conflict over Fatima's relationship had been festering beneath the surface of the family's daily life. In January 2012, just 2 months before the attack, the strain had become so severe that Shaima contacted the Cajon police department to report Fatima missing. The report was canceled just 2 hours later when they located their daughter. But it was another sign of a family struggling to hold together under the weight of cultural expectations and teenage rebellion. For Shaima, a devoted mother and practicing Muslim, the question of how to navigate these conflicts appears to have prompted sober reflection on the structure of her marriage and her future. She had obtained paperwork to file for divorce, and at least 2 of her 5 children were aware that separation could be imminent. She had also spoken about moving to Texas, where her sister lived, a plan that would take her away from the pressures of Al-Cajon and perhaps provide a fresh start for her and the children. For a woman who had spent her entire marriage trying to hold her family together within the bounds of tradition, these were radical considerations. In many ways, Shaima's life in Al-Cajon was a continuation of the resilience she had shown since leaving Iraq. She had built a safe, structured home in a foreign land, maintained her faith. Late on the morning of Wednesday, March 21, 2012, a quiet rental home on Skyview Street in El Cajon, California, became the center of a tragedy that would grip the community and draw national attention. That morning, Shaima Alawati was at home with her 17-year-old daughter, Fatima. Shaima's husband, Kasim Al-Himidi, had left earlier, taking 4 of their younger children to school around 7:30 a.m., just as he did most mornings. The home was familiar, its walls adorned with family photographs, cultural decorations, and reminders of a life carefully built over decades. A blend of Iraqi tradition and American suburban living. According to Kasim, he had returned home after the school run, eaten breakfast, and taken medication prescribed for a kidney condition. He said he went for a drive around 9:30 a.m. Meanwhile, Fatima had stayed home from school that day. She was in her upstairs bedroom when at some point during the late morning, she heard what she would later describe to police as a short moan or squeal coming from the dining area downstairs. She initially assumed her mother might have dropped something, burned herself while cooking, or perhaps broken a dish. The sound was followed about 10 seconds later by what she recognized as breaking glass. But Fatima didn't immediately investigate. She waited about 10 minutes before hunger finally drew her downstairs to the kitchen for breakfast. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Returning to the ground floor of the family's home, the teenager came upon her mother, lying motionless on the dining room floor, bloodied and unconscious, near the kitchen entrance. Shaima was positioned close to the family computer, tangled in the computer mouse cord, her body surrounded by blood that had pooled on the tile floor and splattered in patterns that would later tell investigators this was no accidental fall. The scene was devastating in its brutality. Shaima had been struck repeatedly in the head, at least 6 times, with a blunt object that medical examiners determined was consistent with a tire iron. Her skull had suffered at least 4 fractures from the extremely violent beating. Despite the savage nature of the attack, one detail stood out to investigators. Shaima was not wearing her hijab, the traditional head covering she wore religiously in public. Police would later conclude that this suggested the attack was carried out by someone she knew and trusted, someone she was comfortable being unveiled around. A heavy object, later identified as a tire iron, was found nearby, though it would never be conclusively proven to be the murder weapon. The dining room showed signs of sudden violence, a toppled chair, broken glass, and the unmistakable evidence of a brutal assault. A window and a glass door inside the home were broken, but investigators would later determine that the glass had been smashed from the inside, not by an intruder forcing their way in. Most chillingly, close to her mother's body, about 8 feet away, Fatima noticed a handwritten note. The words, scrawled in imperfect English, were designed to terrorize. "Go back to your country, you're a terrorist." Fatima immediately called 911, her voice frantic and breaking as she begged for help. The call, which would later be played in court during her father's trial, captured the raw terror and confusion of a teenager who had just discovered her mother clinging to life. "I saw her blood. I was in shock," she would later testify. "I kept my eyes away from her as I quickly dialed 911. If I had looked too closely, I think I would have went crazy." Within minutes, paramedics and police officers arrived at the modest home on Skyview Street. The sight inside the home struck even seasoned first responders. A mother of 5 lying helpless on her dining room floor, surrounded by blood that had pooled on the tile and splattered across the nearby surfaces. But it was a crucial detail about Shaima's appearance that would later become a key piece of evidence in understanding this crime. She was not wearing her hijab. For those unfamiliar with Islamic tradition, this detail might seem insignificant, but for investigators and anyone who knew Shaima, it was profound. She was a devoutly religious woman who wore her hijab faithfully in public and around anyone outside her immediate family. The traditional head covering was not just clothing for her, it was an expression of her faith, her modesty, and her identity. The fact that Shaima had been attacked while uncovered told investigators something crucial about her relationship with her attacker. She would only have been without her hijab around people she knew intimately and trusted completely, family members, or someone else with whom she felt comfortable enough to be unveiled. This wasn't a random intruder who had surprised her while she was dressed for the day. This was someone she had no reason to hide from. someone who belonged in her private space. Paramedic Kyle Kleinschmidt, the first medical responder on the scene, would later testify that what he found was clearly not the result of an accidental fall as initially suggested. The blood spatter patterns across the dining room floor, the positioning of her body near the family computer where she had been sitting, and the obvious signs of deliberate trauma all pointed to an intentional and brutal attack. There seemed to be blood splatter across the floor that suggested it wasn't a fall. Kleinschmidt would tell the court during the trial that would follow. The scene clearly indicated not just deliberate violence, but violence committed by someone who had access to Shaima when she was in her most vulnerable state. Uncovered, relaxed, and trusting. The positioning of her body, tangled in the computer mouse cord where she had apparently been sitting when attacked, suggested she had been struck from behind. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been hit at least 6 times in the head with a blunt object, suffering at least 4 skull fractures in what was described as an extremely violent beating. This wasn't a quick assault by a panicked intruder. This was sustained, brutal violence committed against a woman who had been going about her normal domestic routine, comfortable enough in her own home to be without the head covering she wore as protection and identity in the outside world. By the afternoon, local news crews were on the scene, capturing images of police tape strung across the Alawadi home and investigators moving in and out of the property. Officers canvassed the area, speaking to neighbors and searching for anyone who might have seen something unusual that morning. Several residents expressed shock, describing the family as quiet, polite, and devoted to their faith and children. One neighbor reported seeing a dark-skinned male in his late teens or early 20s running from the area carrying what appeared to be a donut-shaped cardboard box, though this lead would later prove unreliable and was never corroborated. As detectives began their preliminary investigation, they started to piece together the timeline of that morning. They spoke with family members, neighbors, and anyone who might have information about the attack. But even in these early hours, some investigators began to notice details that didn't quite fit the narrative of a random hate crime. At the hospital, doctors fought desperately to save Shaima's life. The trauma to her brain was extensive, and despite the medical team's efforts, her condition remained critical. Her family gathered in the waiting area, Kasim having rushed to the hospital after Fatima's call, their grief compounded by confusion and fear. Who could have wanted to harm this gentle woman who had dedicated her life to her family and faith? And why would someone leave such a hateful note? The questions multiplied as investigators began to dig deeper into the family's circumstances, relationships, and the events leading up to that terrible morning. In Cajon, where more than half the 100,000 residents are of Middle Eastern descent, making it home to the second-largest Iraqi community in the United States behind Detroit, the mood mixed grief with fear. If a devoted mother could be beaten with a tire iron in her own dining room with a crude note left behind, what did that say about safety for families who had come to the U.S. to escape violence? The note itself became a fulcrum of the early investigation and public response. Investigators believed the message found near Shaima was a copy. They set out to find an original and any printer or paper that could be linked to it. The existence of an earlier, similar note reported by the family added urgency. If someone had threatened the household before and then followed through, the danger might extend beyond one crime scene. If, however, the note was a plant, then the case might point inward, toward someone attempting to misdirect detectives and the public. It was the sort of bifurcation that homicide investigators know well. 2 plausible paths, 1 crime. The truth would determine not just who was responsible, but whether an entire community needed to fear for their safety. Before we continue, if you're deep into this story and want to see more cases like it, now's the time to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us bring you more real stories, told in full detail. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss when the next episode drops. A Facebook page called 1 Million Hijabs for Shaima Alawadi was launched, featuring photos of college students and women from all backgrounds wearing hijabs in a show of solidarity with the Cajon murder victim. The movement transcended religious lines. Catholics, Quakers, Jews, and atheists shared images, reinforcing that grief and advocacy know no boundaries. The campaign eventually amassed over 12,000 followers, who posted photos of themselves wearing hijabs in solidarity, creating a powerful visual representation of unity against hate. As Al-Cajon police kept their statements measured, national outlets amplified both the horror of the attack and the uncertainty around motive. The Associated Press, ABC News, BBC, and The Guardian all chronicled the discovery of the note and the early decision by authorities to consider bias crime motives among multiple possibilities. The FBI's involvement underscored the stakes. Federal expertise in bias-motivated crimes and forensic analysis would complement local work as evidence accumulated. International attention followed quickly. The U.S. State Department expressed condolences for Shaima's death, and Iraqi government officials attended her funeral in Iraq when her body was flown there for burial. Her death reverberated from San Diego all the way to Baghdad, where it was seen as evidence of the discrimination faced by Iraqi immigrants in America. For a grieving family and a tense community, those headlines offered only partial comfort. The global attention brought resources and support, but it also brought pressure, and the weight of representing something larger than one family's tragedy. On March 27, 2012, just 3 days after Shaima's death, the Cajon Police Department called in federal partners. The FBI offered assistance as Police Chief Jim Redman emphasized that the evidence pointed to an isolated incident rather than an attack targeting the broader community. He also stated that they were investigating all possibilities, carefully avoiding labeling it a hate crime, while urging the public not to jump to conclusions as investigators continued their forensic work. The decision by authorities to maintain investigative discipline, neither confirming the exact wording of the note early on, nor committing to a specific motive, reflected experience with cases where initial appearances can be misleading. One of the most significant breaks in the case came from surveillance video. Investigators obtained footage from cameras located at the school on the street directly behind the Al-Himidi home. This video allegedly showed a person parking a minivan that looked like Kasim's distinctive red 1996 Nissan Quest in an area near the family home, walking away from the vehicle and returning about an hour later before driving off. The footage seemed to contradict Kasim's statements to police that he had taken a drive to relax after returning from taking the children to school. If the surveillance video was accurate, it suggested he had parked nearby and walked back toward his home during the time frame when Shaima was attacked. But perhaps the most troubling revelation came from family members themselves. As investigators interviewed relatives and friends, a picture emerged of a marriage under severe strain. Court documents found in Shaima's car showed that she had been actively researching divorce proceedings. Paperwork to file for divorce had been obtained, though not yet completed, and another form requesting a waiver of fees had been filled out by hand with Shaima's name, address, and phone number. Multiple family members confirmed that Shaima had been discussing leaving her husband and moving to Texas to be near her sister. At least 2 of her 5 children were aware that their mother was considering separation, a radical step for a traditional Muslim woman that suggested the problems in the marriage had become intolerable. The investigation revealed that the family conflicts ran deeper than typical marital difficulties. Fatima's testimony would later reveal that her parents' marriage had been experiencing serious trouble since August 2011, with things becoming particularly bad by January 2012. Her mother had been planning to get a divorce and move to Texas, but when her father saw the divorce papers, he had laughed at her mother, not taking the threat seriously. Shaima was reportedly furious that he wasn't taking her seriously. The domestic tensions were compounded by the ongoing conflicts over Fatima's relationship with her Christian boyfriend and the family's plans for an arranged marriage. Court affidavits revealed that these cultural and generational conflicts had created an atmosphere of constant tension in the household leading up to the murder. As investigators dug deeper, they began to develop a theory that challenged everything the public believed about the case. Rather than a random hate crime perpetrated by an anti-Muslim bigot, the evidence increasingly suggested that Shaima's murder was an act of domestic violence, carefully staged to look like a bias-motivated attack. On November 8, 2012, nearly 8 months after Shaima's murder, investigators took the decisive step they had been building toward throughout their careful investigation. That evening, Kasim Al-Himidi, 48, was called to the Cajon police station. When he arrived, expecting what he may have thought was another routine interview, he was instead arrested and charged with his wife's murder. The arrest marked a dramatic turning point in a case that had captivated international attention. Kasim washed without bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk, noting that he had recently traveled to Iraq for his wife's burial and could potentially flee the country. The irony was not lost on investigators. Kasim had voluntarily returned from Iraq to the United States, potentially walking back into the investigation that would ultimately lead to his arrest. International coverage followed the arrest, with outlets noting the dramatic reversal from the initial hate crime investigation. The Times of Israel reported that Kasim had returned voluntarily from Iraq after Shaima's funeral, further indicating that police had built a compelling case before allowing him to make that trip. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Iraqi-American community in El Cajon, where many had known the family for years. The revelation that what appeared to be an external attack motivated by prejudice was allegedly an intimate betrayal within the family added a different layer of trauma to an already grieving community. For Shaima's children, the arrest represented an almost incomprehensible betrayal. In a matter of months, they had lost their mother to violence, and now faced the possibility that their father was responsible for her death. On April 1, 2014, nearly 2 years after Shaima's murder, the trial of Kasim Al-Himidi began in the El Cajon Superior Court. The man who had once been seen as a grieving widower now sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges of first-degree murder that could result in a sentence of 26 years to life in prison. Judge William McGrath presided over a courtroom that would witness dramatic testimony, emotional outbursts, and the systematic presentation of evidence that prosecutors argued proved Kasim's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. From the moment opening statements began, it was clear this would be no ordinary trial. As Deputy District Attorney Kurt Meckles began laying out the prosecution's case, describing how they believed Kasim had beaten his wife to death because she wanted a divorce. She believed that the defendant had cheated on her and she was done, Meckles told the jury, directly contradicting Kasim's statements to police that his wife wasn't serious about divorce. The prosecution's case painted a picture of a man driven to murder by the prospect of losing his wife and children. McCalls argued that Kasim was distraught over Shaima's plans to leave him and had urged his children and relatives to convince her to stay. When those efforts failed, prosecutors contended he resorted to violence. The defense faced a challenging task, explaining away surveillance video that allegedly showed Kasim's vehicle near the crime scene, witness testimony about his behavior at the hospital, and the discovery of divorce papers in Shaima's car. Gilliland argued that there was no forensic evidence against Al-Himidi, no blood on his clothing or in his vehicle, no fingerprints on the murder weapon, which was never definitively identified, and no witnesses who actually saw him commit the crime. The defense also emphasized that Kasim had cooperated with police throughout the investigation and had returned from Iraq after burying his wife when he could have stayed there to avoid prosecution. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came when Fatima took the stand. Now 19 years old, she had to testify against the father she had once defended, describing the family tensions that had led up to her mother's murder. Wearing a Muslim headscarf, Fatima painted a picture of a family in turmoil in the months before the killing. She testified about the arguments that erupted over whether she would wed a cousin in Iraq in an arranged marriage, and over her relationship with her Chaldean Christian boyfriend. Under direct examination, Fatima told the court that she had broken up with the boyfriend months before the killing, after the argument with her mother that led to her jumping from the moving car. But during cross-examination by defense attorney Richard Burkhan, more complex details emerged. Kasim glared at his daughter during this testimony, then began weeping as she revealed that despite appearing to have ended the relationship, she had actually been secretly meeting with the boyfriend at the family home in the weeks leading up to her mother's murder. "I'd sneak him in sometimes," she admitted. "There was a few times I'd sneak him in at night. I'd open the door for him." The defense displayed text messages between Fatima and her boyfriend from about a week before her mother was attacked. The messages revealed the intensity of their forbidden relationship. "I am the one who is ready to die for you," Fatima had written. "Our love became greater, no matter how much they tried to ruin it." This testimony was devastating for both the prosecution and defense in different ways. For prosecutors, it provided additional motive. If Kasim knew about his daughter's secret relationship, it could have added to his fury over the family's honor being compromised. For the defense, it raised questions about whether someone else might have been involved in or motivated to commit the murder. The prosecution's key evidence included the surveillance video that allegedly showed Kasim parking his red minivan near the crime scene and walking back toward his home during the time frame when Shaima was attacked. Cell phone records and digital evidence helped establish a timeline that contradicted Kasim's statements about taking a drive to relax. Perhaps most damaging was testimony from a family member who said that after the attack, Kasim went to the hospital, touched his wife as she lay unconscious in bed, and apologized to her. The relative testified that Kasim then turned to him and said that if his wife woke up, she might try to say that he had attacked her. The defense countered that the uncle who provided this testimony had always disliked Kasim, and that cultural misunderstandings clouded the interpretation of his words. Muslims often apologize to loved ones who are dying for all the things they did or didn't do in their lives, Gilliland argued. In American courts, such cultural practices could be misinterpreted as admissions of guilt. "It doesn't translate," Gilliland told the jury, emphasizing the cultural gap that could lead to misunderstanding. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury would have to weigh competing narratives. The prosecution's story of a controlling husband driven to murder by the threat of abandonment, and the defense's portrayal of a loving father wrongly accused based on circumstantial evidence and cultural misunderstandings. The trial lasted several weeks, with emotional testimony from family members, detailed forensic evidence, and complex arguments about motive and opportunity. Throughout it all, Kasim's outbursts continued to disrupt proceedings, requiring multiple interventions by the judge. After a day and a half of deliberations, the jury reached their decision on April 17, 2014. As the 12 jurors filed back into the Cajon Superior Court, the tension in the packed courtroom was palpable. Family members, community leaders, and reporters all waited to learn whether Kasim Al-Himidi would be convicted of murdering his wife. When the jury foreman announced the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder with an enhancement for use of a deadly weapon, the courtroom erupted in chaos that would forever be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in San Diego County legal history. The defendant's reaction was immediate and visceral. Kasim shook his head and wagged his finger as the jurors were polled individually to confirm their decision. He began praying and speaking in Arabic, proclaiming to anyone who would listen, "I attest to God that I am not the killer." But it was the reaction of his family that truly captured the devastating impact of the verdict. His oldest son, Mohammed, stood up and shouted obscenities, proclaiming his father's innocence before several deputies had to wrestle him out of the courtroom. Another son also shouted in his father's defense, creating a scene of chaos that required multiple bailiffs to restore order. On the other side of the courtroom, Shaima's family experienced a different kind of emotional release. Her mother, Rahima al-Hussanwi, told reporters through a translator that she was convinced Al-Himidi was the killer, and that, in Iraq, normally if he kills her, he is supposed to be killed in the same way. The verdict represented a complete vindication of the prosecution's theory that this was a case of domestic violence staged to look like a hate crime, not the bias-motivated attack that had initially outraged communities around the world. Fatima, now a young woman who had testified against her father, declined to speak with reporters, but released a statement through her attorney, Ron Rockwell. She said she felt outraged and utterly betrayed, that the defense had suggested during the trial that she might have been involved in the killing. Although we love our father, Fatima said in the statement, we also hate what we believe he did. The convictions split the Al-Himidi family in ways that would never heal. Some of the children accepted their father's guilt, while others continued to believe in his innocence. The tragedy that had begun with the loss of their mother now included the imprisonment of their father and the destruction of their family unit. 2 months later, on June 23, 2014, Judge William McGrath officially sentenced Kasim Al-Himidi to 26 years to life in prison. Due to his previous outbursts, Al-Himidi entered the courtroom bound and surrounded by deputies. Even at sentencing, the defendant could not contain himself. He yelled out in English, "I swear I am not guilty," and then shouted in Arabic to his son before the judge ordered him briefly removed from the courtroom. When he returned, Al-Himidi blew kisses to his 17-year-old son Mohammed and sobbed as the teenager told the court, "I just basically lost both my parents." Mohammed, who had tattooed a drawing of a woman in a hijab on his arm in honor of his mother, struggled to address his father. "That was probably the hardest thing I've done in my entire life so far," Mohammed said. "As much as I want to hate you, I can't." He acknowledged feeling torn between wanting to honor his mother's memory and grappling with forgiveness for his father. The son told the court he wakes up at night thinking of her and breaks down when he remembers, "The man I looked up to all my life is the reason why she is gone." Fatima did not attend the sentencing, but sent a statement that was read in court. Her words cut deep. "What I saw scarred me for life. It disgusts me that you made this look like a hate crime. Mom lives with us every day, but you are the one who will be forgotten." After being sentenced, Al-Himidi yelled out that he would prefer to be sentenced to death and donate his organs. His final outburst was a desperate proclamation of innocence and a rejection of the life sentence that awaited him. The sentence ensured that Al-Himidi, then 50 years old, would likely spend the rest of his productive life in prison. Following his conviction and sentencing, Kasim Al-Himidi's legal team filed appeals challenging both the verdict and the sentence. In 2016, his defense attorneys submitted formal appeals documents, arguing that the trial had been fundamentally unfair due to various factors, including the police department's use of the doctored photograph and other investigative tactics. However, in 2018, the appeals were denied by the California Court of Appeals. Today, more than a decade after her death, Shaima Al-Awadi is remembered not as a victim of the hate crime the world initially believed had claimed her life, but as a woman whose murder exposed the complex realities of domestic violence, the dangers of assumptions, and the ongoing need to protect vulnerable women regardless of the source of their vulnerability. If you found this case as gripping as we did, make sure you don't miss the next story. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who follows true crime.